It's very clear that the Russians and the Chinese have adopted and began to implement a certain policy that relies on Iran as a not only a regional partner, but actually the anchor of their security architecture in the West Asia. And so I think that there's an awareness between these powers that if they don't stick together, they can be picked off one by one by the globalist world order. So, let's say if the Western powers manage to regime change Iran, the would immediately, all those development projects like the North-South transport corridor would be finished. They would not go on anymore. Here's the real reveal. Iran isn't just a country. It's the firewall. Russia and China no isolate one nation control the whole region. But if Iran stays stable, the Russia-Iran-India corridor becomes a trade route that bypasses Western power. That's why Iran is the anchor. Cut the anchor, the entire strategy collapses. The West isn't afraid of Iran itself. They're afraid of what connects through Iran. So the whole Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, SEO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think treats Iran as an integral part of all these developments. And you know what the West does is when they regime change a country, then they weaponize their country against its neighbors and against other powers in the region, in the same way that they used Ukraine to weaken and destabilize Russia. They could use Iran to weaken and destabilize Russia as well. And that's the pattern. When the West topples a government, it's not just about control. It's about weaponizing that country against its neighbors. Ukraine was used to pressure Russia. Iran would be used the same way for Russia and China. Iran isn't optional. It's strategic armor. They could use Russia if they managed to regime change Russia and bring, some new Boris Yeltsin type in there. They could then use Russia to destab, basically to attack China, in the same way that they used Ukraine to attack Russia. So I think that there's a growing awareness that this is how the West plays its game, and that, for the Chinese, it's vitally important that Vladimir Putin and his government remain in power in Moscow. And that there's a continuity of policy, that there isn't some Vladimir Zelensky brought to Kremlin by the West. And then the same applies to the relationship with Russia and Iran and China and Iran. So I think that they all see that they depend upon each other for their security. And so I think that you're absolutely right that this is more than an alliance. This is strategic teamwork on every level. This is the pattern. Regime change, install a pliable leader, weaponize the country against the next target. Ukraine was used against Russia. If Russia fell, Russia would be used against China. That's why Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran aren't just allies. They're mutual insurance policies. There is nothing coming out of the administration. The Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor are the same, Marco Rubio, and nobody knows what Marco Rubio is and what does he want. Yeah, it's clearly a case of strategic ambiguity. And I think it's a certain thing that they're doing this on purpose. This wouldn't be an accident. They're doing it on purpose. And the purpose is that they're concealing their true intentions. And so we have a hard time interpreting what they're doing, what they're trying to do, and what's going on. But I have to say, for me, this situation is much, much preferable to what we had with Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland and all of those people. Because those people were one-track mind, driving us towards escalations in the Middle East, in Ukraine against Russia against China, and they were already putting things in place. they're putting pieces in place for all those wars. You know, Biden was saying like, oh yeah, three-front war, no problem. We're the, United States of America, for God's sake. We can beat everybody. Trump is obviously doing something very, very different. And for me, the really, really important changes in the new administration is we have a good, constructive relations between Russia and the United States, which is, you cannot overestimate how important that is, because these are the two primary nuclear powers, and the greatest risk of nuclear annihilation that for all of humanity. So the fact that the two administrations are talking to each other, that they're on friendly terms, and that they're moving in some kind of important. Next part of that deal is that Trump declined to give a security guarantee to Ukraine. That is, that was the tripwire. That was the trigger for World War II. He declined that, and he's winding down U.S. involvement in Project Ukraine, and he's forcing Europe to wind down there. The Europeans are still supporting Ukraine. They're still fantasizing about going to war against Russia. But the reality is that they can't do a whole lot about it right now. Trump avoided going to war against Iran. He explicitly said that he was not interested in regime change in Iran. And so, on the basis of important policy moves that we've seen over the last 10 months, I much prefer Trump administration than Biden administration. Now, obviously, he's under huge pressure from the Zionist lobby, from Wall Street, from probably military-industrial complex and everywhere else, to do other things. And to, probably get back to the, same policies of the American administration that we had since World War II. And I think that is the reason, that pressure is the reason why he's driving everybody crazy, including us. And so how to understand Syria, how to understand Nigeria, how to understand Venezuela, Yemen, and more, and so on. I'm never sure. I'm never sure what the answer is. But I certainly think that we did move a very important step away from the precipice of nuclear annihilation since Trump came into office. Notice what Alex just revealed. Ambiguity isn't confusion. It's a tactic. When a government doesn't clearly state its goals, it becomes saying, we need to cooperate with Russia. We need Russian gas. We need Russian resources. Because otherwise our economies are going to be destroyed. And so people from the IFD are speaking openly about this, which is almost impermissible in Germany. But this is where we are. And I think the future of Europe lies in partnership with Russia in multipolar integrations. Want energy, trade, and survival. The elites see war. The people see reality. Without Russian resources, Europe doesn't have an economy. The future isn't ideology. It's partnership or collapse. And last week, I participated in Verona Eurasian Economic Forum in Istanbul. And a first time I was invited to this event was 4 years ago in Baku, Serban. And I remember, my impressions that these were very constructive events. There were discussions about development, industrialization, building up of infrastructure that were not, simply, bloyating about some future thing. Promises of, people were talking about very concrete things that were being developed as we were speaking there. And so, now a friend of mine, just returned from Baku, Azerbaijan, just as I was leaving Istanbul. And he posted an analysis, and he said that Baku, Azerbaijan, in these 4 years, they built 4,000 kilometers of highways, of 447 bridges, and some tunnels, one of which is the second longest tunnel in the world, 16 viaducts. This all happened in the space of less than 5 years, and they spent $5 billion on all this. And this is, If it's happening in China, if it's happening in Russia, in Azerbaijan, it can be happening anywhere. It can be happening in Europe, which is a very, very different kind of worldview to move your society in that direction versus pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into military-industrial complex and into preparation for war, because you're saying, oh, by 2028, 2029, we're going to go to war against Russia. So we know what our leaders want. This is the contrast no one in Europe wants to talk about. Some countries are building highways, bridges, and tunnels. Europe is building war plans. One vision builds prosperity. The other prepares for destruction. The question isn't who has more power. It's who has a future. We also know what the ordinary people want. And the contrast couldn't be more stark. So the question is going to be, is the democracy going to prevail? Or are these inbred degenerate elites going to prevail? And, it's hard to say Ukrainians didn't want to go to war against Russia, but they ended up forced. So I don't know if Europe is going to be able to resist this push into war. It'll depend on us. But I see a lot of people are waking up. But I also see a lot of people who are very complacent and are just kind of shrugging their shoulders, or like, oh, what can we do? I'm just a person. I can't do very much. We'll see. I genuinely hope, and I would like anybody listening to this to understand that our cooperation, our compliance and acquiescence to all developments, including war, is essential to them. Us passively going along with what they're forcing us into is handing them a success. Us resisting and saying loudly and categorically no, we will not go to war against Russia will stop the march to war. So, I guarantee you that a lot of parents in Ukraine right now probably wish they would have been a bit more forceful in resisting the march to war, even at risk to their safety, their jobs, their incomes, and so forth. Because the alternative is visiting your children under the flag of your country 6 feet under the ground. Because they were sacrificed in those wars. If we don't want that, we're going to have to push back, and we're going to have to push back decisively and boldly, and maybe even tolerate a little bit of risk to to ourselves personally. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Wars don't happen because leaders want them. They happen because people don't resist them. Silence is compliance, and compliance is the fuel of every war in history. The moment people say no, not in our name, the war machines stop.